Hey, it's Professor Wham here. Much overdue podcast. And I'm doing one on something I didn't think I was going to do. I'm working on a couple of others, and this one just popped up. Basically, my job, especially before Thanksgiving, is always a little slow right before Thanksgiving because school district administrators seem to check out early. They're just sick of all the constant requests and complaints. So that left a little time last week while slogging through paperwork to listen to and occasionally visually attend the new Graham Hancock series on Netflix, which he calls The Ancient Apocalypse. Of course, this is the screenshot here of the trailer. And you can see my title of this, Defending the Blinders, Graham Hancock and the Never-Ending Apocalypse. Now, as always, Graham, and I will call him by his first name because I've interviewed him, even though I'm sure he wouldn't remember or admit to it, claims in this trailer, in this series, that he's examining only one big story, but in fact is trying to cram 3 to 4 hypotheses together into a grand theory that will explain, if not everything, then so much. So some of it is a throwback to stuff he's done before, and he's trying to update it. His obsessions are the same. First, he looks at the evidence for previously unknown and or lost civilizations, which there is some evidence of that. Then he looks for commonalities in terms of mythological motifs and architecture among various of the known civilizations. And finally, he looks for evidence of a massive natural disaster which could have affected the development of civilizations immediately before and after the final stage of the last ice age, and how civilization developed after that. And there is some evidence for this. Now, all these piles, and I will call them piles of evidence, are then jumbled together to try to make the case that there was an ice age civilization, and I immediately thought of Game of Thrones as Atlantis, which scattered after a cataclysm, which suddenly warmed and then cooled parts of the earth, and then froze it again and gave rise to subsequent civilizations. Graham still seems to be looking for the master plan, even though none of the evidence he cites really needs such a narrative. And below, I'm going to unpack why. So now let me say from the outset that I personally have no problem with the idea that there were civilizations prior to the last ice age, and that our present narrative about the history of civilization is woefully inadequate, especially about in the Americas and in Africa. I've been saying that for years, simply because there is evidence for it, and it seems to make sense. While the Ice Age impacted the entire planet, ice sheets did not cover the entire Earth, and there were many places in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and certainly Australia, where there was little or no ice at all. At this point, the number of possible ruins, settlements, and ancient cities which have been found that were demonstrably covered by rising sea levels runs into at least the dozens, if not hundreds, of examples. And what's weird about this documentary is that while I was watching it, I could think of examples of known drowned cities and structures that could have actually bolstered some of his particular perspective, but he doesn't use. And I had to wonder, what was that about? Did he just not know about these places, or did he not go to those places? I mean, who knows? He'll have to answer that at some point. There are earthworks and ruins throughout parts of South America, Africa, and the Middle East that can only be seen from the sky because of their size. Some of the sites that have been dated indicate origins that violate official archaeological narratives about human development. Now, this alone indicates that there is still and excuse my plain talk here, metric buttload that we don't know about how and where humans lived. Additionally, many of the mythological stories of flood and earth upheavals, which he mentions from diverse, although almost always northern hemispheric sources, could contain elements of truth and be actual accounts of observation of sudden catastrophic events occasioned by the planet passing through comet debris. And of course, this could have given rise to what is often called the Younger Dryas period, which he cites a lot, when the gradual warming of the planet was temporarily interrupted by what appears to be a celestial impact of some kind. Now, something indeed happened in the northern hemisphere, which resulted in the rapid extinction of megafauna, or at least helped it along, especially in North America, and the laying down of a layer of burned material in the geologic record, at least in the northern hemisphere, as I said. And here is one map that I was able to find online. There are a number of maps you can get which indicate this, where you can look at the Younger Dryas impact zones. It does appear as if the Earth went through probably the debris field of a comet, a large comet. And it's possible that several pieces of this debris field hit the planet in several different places. There is an impact. There's impact up here in Greenland. These are all of the different places, by the way, where they have found evidence of an impact. And evidence of, you might say, where the Younger Dryas zone is. So you can see here that the boundary here is mostly in the northern hemisphere, although you'll notice that we don't have a lot of information from the larger Eurasian continent, whether that's because it's buried in permafrost or whatever, who knows. But you'll notice that much of the southern hemisphere, especially south of the equator, is hardly apparently impacted by this at all. I don't have any issue with the idea that there might have been civilizations that were impacted by this. In fact, it was a large enough planetary event that it would have impacted everybody a little bit. It just would not have led to some of the wholesale extinctions and the massive displacements of earth and water that we see evidence of in North America. And, Graham actually does a pretty good job of talking about some of that stuff. There is evidence for some massive catastrophic events in the Pacific, what is now the Pacific Northwest, and in Canada. And I can say that the Hudson Valley, the topography of the Hudson Valley was shaped in part by this event as well. In fact, there's some evidence of a large lake that collapsed and flooded parts of what is now the Hudson Valley. It's a very long and complicated geologic history. So I don't have any problem with any of this. So I have no issue with any of those suppositions. It's how Graham then mixes and mashes his cultural information and runs roughshod over other important pieces of data and methods of approach to which I take exception. Part of Graham's beef is with mainstream archaeology itself, which is fair enough in some respects. I have some beefs with them as well. But it also causes him to make overbroad generalizations in other areas. For it is one thing to say that human civilizations, at least on some parts of the planet, were disturbed, altered, or destroyed by celestial doom, and then had to reassemble themselves, and another thing to assert that there was one master civilization which then bequeathed its knowledge to all subsequent civilizations everywhere thereby. Graham somehow wants to say both, when by his own accounting such is not necessary. First, he and some of his archaeological authorities provide evidence that during the last ice age, there was probably more land to walk around on, since the ocean level was an average of about 400 feet lower than it is currently. Humans do walk around a lot, being an inquisitive primate species. Now, all this implication to me was that early civilizations probably did what later civilizations did. Shared lots of information along trade routes. If that is the case, then there probably isn't a need for anything like a central Atlantis. Information will be passed along and preserved simply because that's part of what humans do. In fact, one of my favorite stories of this kind of transfer involves how surprised archaeologists were when they found cloves in the burial site of a Mesopotamian noblewoman who was interred about 4,000 years ago. Now, at that point, as far as anyone knows, the plants that generate cloves, what were called the Molucca Islands, by the European colonizers, only occurred on one or two islands in one place in the world at that time. Now cloves are grown in other places, but at that time they only grew in one or two islands in what is now Indonesia, which is on the other side of Asia, basically from Mesopotamia. Yet here were cloves in this woman's grave, and they probably came via via India, because we now know that Mesopotamia was trading with India. But what a grand tale of trade and travel lay within these little flower buds, if you think about it. Graham then uses the oversimplification argument of, look at how alike all these ancient monuments are, namely pyramids, ziggurats, earth mounds, etc., insofar as they are all mini mountains and often evince specific astronomical alignments to stars and the solstices and equinoxes, and more rarely to moon cycles, as proof of a central nexus of knowledge that this hidden and destroyed civilization maintained and then passed on to everybody. He criticizes mainstream archaeological interpretations of such buildings and alignments as relying on mere coincidence of development. He says that several times. That's actually not what archaeologists say now. I have criticisms of mainstream archaeology, but the mainstream narratives are actually more sophisticated than that. Graham seems to forget that the purpose of a large building in the ancient world, and actually the purpose of a large building in our world, is to magnify the political power of a ruling authority who usually was invoking a religious dispensation in some way. Most monolithic structures were not built all at once, but over time, in stages, at places where religious and political authority was already recognized, like a local shrine or water source. I have here a whole bunch of different pyramid structures from around the world. You can see we've got ziggurats, we've got Egyptian things, we've got some stuff from Mesoamerica, we've got some stuff from China, we've got some stuff from Indonesia, all kinds of things here. Now, how do we know this? How do we know why and how certain things were built? Well, if there are written records, which there are in some instances, they tell exactly why and when such structures were built and by whom, which is something people continuously forget, especially about Egyptian monuments. In other cases, as in indigenous North American monuments, there is often extensive oral tradition providing historical contexts. Sometimes the evidence is right in front of a person. Now, astrological and astronomical alignments were often incorporated into such structures because the skies provided the basis for calendrical systems, the measurement of time, seasons, and eventually history. Sirius was significant to the Egyptians because its rising in the summer portended the all-important flooding of the Nile. Early in Egyptian history, that flooding encompassed a large part of the plain in which the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx, a now recognized older structure, sit. Now, even after the Nile changed course over time, as the desertification processes surrounding northern Egypt increased, the original site of the first shrines were recognized and immortalized, and the pharaohs that could organize the building of the monuments thought they'd be remembered too. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't mysteries about the pyramids. Of course there are. It's not like the builders wrote everything down simply so we later generations would understand everything they were thinking. It's just that we're talking about human beings here, not mystic descendants of some cosmic species. When the Mayans were building their pyramids and aligning them to the motions of the celestial bodies, they were not only creating observatories to keep track of the divine order of the cosmos, they wanted their structures to mirror that order and perfection they saw in the heavens, an order that was not reflected in the earthly world of drought, floods, and earthquakes. This is not some quaint interpretation, but what the living, present Mayan people have said about their ancestors. And finally, Western archaeologists have started listening to what descendants of some of these structures have said about what their ancestors were doing. Such things were done in China under the Confucian rule of secular rulers for centuries, simply because it helps the whole to keep track of things. It's also a way of invoking the order of the cosmos and reproducing it on Earth, a kind of representative magic. It's not rocket science, actually. The fact of pyramidal structures isn't rocket science either. Humans seem to be somewhat vertically oriented, being a largely hierarchical species in the sense we take more after woodland chimps than bonobos. We tend to look up to people and classes in power, and the folks in those positions want the masses to do just that. If one looks at the evolution of pyramids in Egypt, China, or Mesoamerica, one sees the same patterns. The initial structures were small, and then over time got larger and larger as subsequent generations took over, as settlements spread out. One didn't destroy the old. The older was surpassed by succession, its power and prestige incorporated into new structures, recycled, refitted. In fact, Graham describes this process himself several times. And pyramid shapes? Well, here's the deal about pyramids. If they're made correctly, pyramid shapes are more stable from an engineering standpoint, particularly in areas of flood or earthquake, which is particularly important since river valleys were the foci, the focus of civilization development. There's nothing secret about this. Look it up. This isn't feigned coincidence. It's mathematics and engineering. That's why Monk's Mound, Cahokia, in East St. Louis has survived repeated floods and earthquakes. If you pay attention to what kind of building is being built where, it suddenly becomes clear why pyramids are the logical, not coincidental, choice of many ancient monument builders. And for some reason, by the way, we tend to focus on pyramids, even though if you just look at these, they all look a little bit different. They're kind of generically pyramidal, but they're very different pyramids. We tend to focus on pyramids, not the numerous square and rectangular buildings that are also always present. You know, these civilizations didn't just build pyramids, they also built a variety of other things that you find replicated everywhere. Why don't we focus on those? We focus on pyramids because they grab our attention. It's really that simple. Finally, in order to get me on to the next track, it is simply not necessary that a social collapse necessitates the existence of a super civilization to get things started again. Before the rise of classical Greece, there was a tumultuous collapse of civilization in the Mediterranean, probably caused by a gigantic volcanic explosion that destroyed the Minoan culture and almost everybody else in the vicinity, certainly put a dent in the trade routes. There was a dark age, and then poof, classical Greeks are everywhere. And I haven't even mentioned the Macedonians. This happened in Europe more than once, and we have information about many of the phases. The Bronze Age in Europe ended very suddenly. It appears to have been a pandemic. Several of these cycles recurred until the huge die-off during the Black Death. Similar phases of civilization collapse and reemergence have occurred throughout human history. In each case, survivors figured out ways of going on and passed information to successors, sometimes newbies who had migrated into an area, as in the case of the Celts and the Germanic tribes after the fall of the Bronze Age, or the Aryan migrants into North India during the collapse of the Indus civilizations, and sometimes by regrouping and creating a new order, as the Egyptians after the Hyksos invaded, or the Han Chinese after the Mongolian Empire finally fell, and they were one of the last final casualties of the Black Plague. No Atlantis or a giant in the earth is needed to pass on civilization information. Regular humans do it just fine. And this leads me to two of Graham's most egregious theoretical toe stubs, stubbing of the toes. First, his invocation of Göbekli Tepe as the Rosetta Stone of this great apocalypse which ended Ice Age civilization. And second, his abortive attempt to cram the Great Serpent Mound of Ohio into this narrative. I'm not even going to deal with some of the stuff that he does with Quetzalcoatl. Now, I agree with Graham that Göbekli Tepe and other similar sites in Turkey are remarkable. They are old, they violate the mainstream archaeological narrative about nomadic societies, and reveal that there are all kinds of ways in which Western obsessions with linear cultural development, namely hunter-gatherer, agriculture, husbandry, village, city, are probably just wrong. Because only a tiny portion of the Göbekli Tepe site has been excavated, I think it's really too soon to try to understand what all the carvings could possibly mean. It's like trying to understand the contents of a book by reading a few possibly random pages in the middle of it. No one, Graham, archaeologists, or religious millenarians, should be trying to sell us a definitive interpretation yet. And in fact, here's a lovely picture of it. And yes, it is on a mound. The mound was created by the burying of this structure, and the complex is ginormous. Only a percentage of it has been excavated. But of course, Graham goes ahead anyway, speculating wildly about how the dating of the site must by implication be related to the climactic shifts that occurred during the celestial splat that impacted the ending of the last ice age. It might be, but there's really no way to know. The notion that hunter-gatherers could by themselves not be organized enough to build structures like Göbekli Tepe only shows us that we probably don't know much about hunter-gatherers. Many indigenous nomadic and semi-nomadic groups, such as the Cheyenne and Shawnee in North America, specifically built large, even monumental structures and effigies specifically for clans to gather around during certain times of the year in order for the whole people or nation to reacquaint themselves. Now, one of these structures on the high plains is that giant medicine wheel, which some of you have probably heard of. That medicine wheel has been traced by archaeologists to a number of similar medicine wheels that exist in Saskatchewan, Canada, and were clearly connected to early Algonquin peoples. That structure, even though it is not monumental in a pyramidal aspect, is monumental in other ways because it not only follows the phases of the sun and of the moon, but it also follows the position of various fixed stars, and was used not only by the Cheyenne, but by a number of other Northern Plains peoples who added to it as they were using it over time. I mean, it is a monumental structure, and it was used and built specifically to bring nomadic people together at particular times during the year in order that they could reestablish themselves as a single people. The pre-Islamic shrine, or Kaaba, at Mecca existed for precisely the same reason. Muhammad simply adopted and adapted the shrine for a new use. There is substantial evidence that Stonehenge was used in a similar way by the semi-nomadic peoples who predated the Celts. And the fact that Göbekli Tepe was purposely buried is fascinating, but not without precedent. Among many indigenous peoples, not only in the Americas, but in India and throughout Asia, if a religious structure loses its potency and is no longer considered important, functional, or becomes associated with bad rule, magic, or sorcery, it is often ceremonially destroyed, buried, or abandoned. Thus, Pueblo peoples throughout the Southwest in North America would burn and or deliberately bury kivas or other ceremonial buildings. Throughout northern India during the immediate post-Ashoka period, Buddhist shrines would be buried or left to the jungle. The Mayan people buried or left their structures to be similarly consumed by the forests prior to the Spanish. European Christians deliberately buried or burned or obliterated whole villages or centers of worship that they couldn't rehab into churches in both Northern Europe and in the Americas. Deliberate abandoning or burying of sites because they are no longer considered centrally sacred is not at all uncommon, and this should probably be the first proffered explanation of Göbekli Tepe's internment. And finally, what the hell is Graham doing with the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio? Now, in the series, Graham is upset because the authorities who oversee the well-being of the mound structure there in Ohio won't let him near it. He insinuates that it's mainstream archaeological bad guys who don't want to be associated with his superior alternative theories, who are just covering up the truth and are preventing him from filming at the site of the Serpent Mound, although obviously no one can keep him from making a story about it. Now keep in mind, this is the same Graham who earlier in his literary history tried to argue that Indian mounds may have been built by Celts or lost Israelites. Keep in mind that less than a decade ago, Graham was also arguing that the secret tomb of Merlin might be found on an island off the coast of North America. When I pointed out to him that the graves in question that he was looking at, and actually there's more than one on the site he mentions, and that when I pointed out that these graves followed the exact layout of the standard Algonquin grave site for a revered leader or religious figure, he refused to respond. Now, his association with Gregory Little has at least moderated his views enough that he no longer believes in literal giants who bequeathed their inheritance Ice Age civilization culture to subsequent generations. They're only giants in terms of knowledge, and acknowledges that the mounds and other great earthworks were built by indigenous peoples of the Americas. Bully for him. Now, his outrage at not being allowed to film the Great Serpent Mound directly belies his inability to understand how the administrative position of that artifact has changed. Because first off, we know who built the Serpent Mound and when it was constructed. Although the term Fort Ancient is still used as a basic descriptor for it, and that dates back to like the 18th century, it is generally understood that divisions of the Shawnee developed the site into its present form. It is a relatively recent structure, as the mound works in Ohio go, and it's actually an effigy, not a mound, and was constructed in order to signal Shawnee participation in the agricultural maize cult that had spread across much of the eastern woodlands. So it is not surprising in the least that the Serpent Mound has astronomical implications as almost all of the great mound structures in the Ohio Valley do. Sorry, I was misreading something that I wrote. It would probably not be surprising that the Serpent Mound was built on a previously sacred site. Again, that's common. It's common in the Americas. It's common everywhere else in the world. It would do nothing but prove that the desire to tap into already established traditional sacramental places appears to be a common human tendency. Seneca historian and lorekeeper Barbara Alice Mann, whose two books I consulted for this and that I would highly recommend for you if you have not read them to read them, and in fact, as I say here, read all of her books if you care about Indigenous America. You don't have to necessarily agree with everything she says, but she pulls out primary sources that nobody else has touched and does work not only as a standard historian, but as a Seneca oral lore keeper. So she is doing a really important work here, talking about Indigenous America, not only from a normal historical and archaeological standpoint, whatever normal is, normative Western, but also talking about it as an Indigenous person. So, very important work here. And she speaks directly in both of these books about the long history of Western interpreters attempting to make over the serpent mound in their own cultural image. Now, Graham is every bit as guilty of this. Now, while he doesn't go down the serpent as Satan route, like some millenarian Christians do, he makes the same error that most Euro-mythological universalists do by referring to the serpent mound as representing a snake eating an egg. The problem with this is the motif of an egg-eating snake appears nowhere in any North American mythology. That's something that occurs in certain Eurasian mythologies, but it is not an indigenous American motif. Interpreting what the snake effigy through Western lenses has created a host of problems which always occur when one does not consult the actual historical creators of an object, especially if they still live. As Mann puts it, simply plopping mangled tradition into the discussion as generically Indian, leaving it shorn of the associated matrix, I can't use her word, the associated matrix peculiar to its nation of origin, is disingenuous and not very helpful. I'll read that again. Simply plopping mangled tradition into the discussion as generically Indian, leaving it shorn of the associated matrix to which it comes from, peculiar to its nation of origin, is disingenuous and not very helpful. So, as I'm going to read in a little bit, in short, what indigenous tradition maintains is that the original site of the Serpent Mound was of Cherokee origin and was taken over by the Shawnee, who were often allies of the Cherokee, when the former were driven from what is now Ohio in a series of armed conflicts. The egg is not being swallowed. It is the, and I will try to pronounce this, the Ulansiti stone carried in between the horns of a great horned serpent, often referred to in Cherokee as an uktana. If you know the stories of the uktana is a horned serpent that actually has a jewel that either is carried on its chest, like the naga in India, it's carried on its chest, or it carries in between its horns. And it usually carries it in between its horns when it's traveling. That the horned serpent, a potent representation of the power of earth, water, and serpent, would be found close to round and geometric structures, usually representing powers of sky, fire, and eagle, and apparently there was originally an eagle effigy nearby, but it has been destroyed, is for Mann indicative that the Serpent Mound must be seen within its total environment, not as a stand-alone monument. So I'm going to read a little bit here from Native America and the Mounds. Dating back to, the earliest part of it dating back to around 1000 BCE. That's the earliest part of the monument. So she does agree that it was built in several stages. This huge effigy is clearly a snake, but what is on its head? Western scholars have often speculated that it was an egg or the sun in the serpent's mouth, and in fact that's kind of what Graham implies by demonstrating that there is an alignment with the head of the serpent to a solstice sun, which is fine, that's perfectly fine. With some going on to interpret both as symbols of life. Eggs are not at all symbols of life among Eastern nations, however. In fact, turtle eggs buried with the dead were thought by the Iroquois to have been sure signs that wrinkled shamans, bad shamans, had been at work. The sun explanation, based on a vaguely referenced tradition of a snake once swallowing the sun, is equally shaky, for the tradition is seldom identified by culture, and when it is, the swallowing animal turns out not to be a snake. Conversely, the notion of important spirits carrying medicine bags or other medicine objects is culturally specific to Eastern groups. The Olensitu stone as the medicine bag of the horned serpent was very probably an idea that the Cherokee picked up in the East. The object as representing the medicine bundle of the horned serpent is therefore a likely candidate for the meaning of the oval located smack in the middle of the serpent's head. The horned serpent does not always show his horns, by the way. There is a related aspect of the serpent mound that also argues it to have been a horned serpent. Archaeologists have long noted that the first stage mound builders constructed only circles without the attached square. She goes into some of the symbolism there, and it's fairly complicated. She mentions that there were other, I'm condensing like 3 paragraphs here. Basically, she's mentioning that there were other animal effigies that were also connected to the serpent effigy, many of which have been destroyed. Rather than the definitive, exhaustive final word on the subject, this treatment of the mounds in terms of tradition is intended as a primer, seeking to demonstrate how the halved wholes of Eastern thought inhere in the logic of the mounds, particularly the traditions of the descendants of the Ohio Valley mound builders. By seeing the primary node of sky-earth through the associated nodes of fire, water, and eagle serpent, I hope to point scholars toward those paths most likely to end in truly native perceptions of mound culture. Now, in this, her later book, this Spirits of Blood, Spirits of Breath, she goes a little bit further in some of this talk that she started in the Mound book. And she reproduces in the book, this is on page 75, I believe, she reproduces another horned serpent earthwork, which actually is in Rice County, Kansas, and can only be seen from the sky. It's very similar to the way in which it was constructed is very similar to that of that great horseman in England that has been carved into the chalk. And this is a very similar kind of form, but if you look very closely, what you have is a serpentine shape, and then you have a similar kind of construction here, where you have what looks like 2 horns and something being suspended in the middle of it. It's almost an identical design as what you find in the Serpent Mound in Ohio. And this is what her surrounding documentation says. And this is where she's talking about a lot of different traditions. Let's see if I can find it here very specifically. So on page, what is this? Page 67 of Spirits of Blood, Spirits of Breath. One of the funny things about Barbara Mann is that she divides her narrative up into several parts. And the parts are question and answer parts. So she'll have like an ask Barbara part. So ask Barbara, question, is his mouth open? No. Is he eating an egg? No. And you're talking about the serpent, obviously. This is the sort of situation in which scholars should just break down and ask Indians what the heck they are looking at instead of making up their own answers out of whole cloth. The Cherokee have, for instance, long informed scholars about the Ulansuti stone of the great horned serpent, that it was a big shining medicine stolen from him by a Shawnee, adopted by the Cherokee in ancient times, thus transferring his medicine to the Shawnee. Women kept these stones, bringing them out for major divination purposes. Settlers took one gander at the stones and, deciding they were amethysts, rubies, or other precious jewels, promptly stole them. The Ulansuti stone is not a gem, however, but for the most part various crystals, and it is scary medicine. Second, the Ulansuti is not in the serpent's mouth, but is hanging from his horns. Like every other creature, the great horned serpent carries a medicine bundle. If one is a snake, however, then the problem arises of how to carry one's bundle. The serpent solves this conundrum by extruding his horns whenever he travels and slinging his bundle between them. Thus, what Western scholars have deemed jaws are horns, and what is between them is the serpent's medicine bundle hanging from his horns as he races out of his coils. Inside the bundle is his shining Ulan-Suti stone, which a 19th century Dakota witness described as a red object shining like fire. The horned serpent was and is an extremely powerful force and being that many indigenous peoples of North America recognized. In fact, Graham actually mentions them earlier in his documentary, and misrepresents a Zoroastrian myth along the way, not only telling what of the story he finds useful, and not indicating that the story was preserved by Muslim tradition in Iran. But for some reason, he cannot wrap his mind around the idea that the serpent mound is a horned serpent. Now, rather than being a victim of mainstream archaeological naysayers, Graham was probably not allowed to film at the site because of his history of playing loose with indigenous data, and because indigenous representatives are now permitted to weigh in on who gets to visit that site, since it's so remarkable and Westerners seem to covet it. It's just as likely that Shawnee consultants said no, because Graham didn't come to them and ask nicely. So bad, so sad, wham. So after watching all the episodes, all I could think of was, Graham, just stop. Until you get past your own blind obsessions, you need to stop. And so I want to finish this by reading a little bit more from this Native Americans, Archaeologists in the Mounds book by Barbara Mann. I urge those who find this method intriguing, and that includes the method I've been using in this particular video, to begin by discarding academia's determined monoculturalism, which has influenced Graham despite the fact that he decries it, and to continue by dismantling its artificial barriers to recognizing the living descendants of the mound builders, and by extension, the living descendants of lots of the monumental structures in the world where those descendants still exist. Next, I encourage scholars to forge respectful relationships with those descendants, that they may spend quality time in tradition and among traditionals, listening as much as talking, absorbing instead of Euroforming. Nothing will be lost in the process, but much stands to be gained by all. And don't even get me started on how he refuses to deal with and or misrepresents almost all of the major religions.